I wanted to talk about Gary in terms of, I kind of wanted to neutralize Gary's rage at, uh, based on my notion that rage comes when somebody's uncomfortable, or that they're being brought into being caught or seen in a manner either that discloses something real about themselves, but something that they don't want to see about themselves. And so they hide behind a mask of rage and hate. And I was thinking that to bring a paradox up to Gary might not be a bad idea. And the paradox is the idea that Gary is dogmatic, but because he's dogmatic, does not by default make him religious. I think Gary's dogmatic but not religious, where Gary's defense, his desire to not be considered religious because of all of his the ill consequent of his character, his self-characterization on the tubes, is to be a non-believer, a disbeliever in anything paranormal or otherworldly, anything that might be considered alien, and a definition of alien as divine. And but his defenses are that he's not dogmatic when he obviously keeps reiterating a quad characteristics of what it is to be sentient, and when he could easily add animation to the quad, that part of being sentient is that you are in movement, that you move, that you have a will to move, unlike what he would grant to a plant that's simply following its environment, that sentience requires a movement and interaction or metabolism. And to say that the interaction or metabolism is not necessarily part of addiction is one corner of his quad as addiction, or interest that it goes beyond consumption or reproduction. Something akin to maybe a plant following the sun, moving in like a cold-blooded, like a lizard moving into the sun, not as addiction, but as a survival technique, and not for consumption, but as a means of being able to worm itself so that it may animate itself and move faster. And so thinking about the idea that I still wouldn't coin Gary as religious, or as Anton would with a crypto-religiosity, as much as I think that Anton is incredibly guilty of being religious in his orientation, minus his claims for a transcendental God. He will describe a not knowing as ambiguous, and I think the common misnomer of describing one's not knowing, lack of knowing, or not understanding something as something ambiguous is poor. Also, back to With Gary, the paradox would be to convince him that there's more to his quad dogma, that even he, upon losing the reiteration, could add to the dogma of the quad. Right. Now this already would cause a violation where he'd probably in response to this enrage him, and we'd see an expression of rage or an insistence, a reiterability of insistence. We have 4 years, according to himself, as reiterating roughly the same ideals while refining it with a drive to perpetuate, in terms of social media and our interaction with him, nothing more than an extension of the perpetuation of these 4 ideas. Now, maybe the paradox that's going on with Gary in terms of not wanting to identify with that which is religious and noting that he's still dogmatic, even though I don't see him as religious in terms of him not grouping or communing, but seeking communion or interaction like a religion, but not achieving it, and a desire to make certain that to flesh out the differences he has with anyone that seeks communion with him, to make certain that he batters or banishes them, allowing individualistic character, allowing someone to say he's authored a quad that is unique and hence notable, and put him in a place of notoriety. And so his attempts, I believe, are to gather notoriety, and from that, hopefully, some catapulting and influence of grounding people into what I think is a more vernacular sense, kind of a regenerative sense of American individualism, 1970s, pre-internet, pre-mass one-world communication notions. I believe that is a paradigm that's wrongly held by Anton or people that seek to bring people into a fold of communications or reading lists, suggesting that a monism or a homogeny of thought is not only to be ordered and gathered and spun around in a particular fashion. It's actually, I think what's disgusting is the idea of stacked authorship instead of, I mean, my particular attempt for individualism for Gary, something I think he's good at, besides the content, is making certain he circumnavigates with immediate fresh ideas, to make certain that the authorship that's excavated and put forth in front of him is fresh to mind from some immediate influence, and from his own creation, his own interaction away from a history of authorship. I believe he's not religious because he doesn't agree to follow authorships. He'd rather scratch out the author. And same with me. I agree to scratch out the author, to not allow authorial commands. It's not to wash away people that would like to do that, but to not allow their doing that to take precedent, to not allow authorial reiterations and claims, school histories, macrame ties, to embolden a strength that is supposedly dominates over an individual's dynamic use of their language and capacity to interact with one another, in a moment where I think that's more amazing. Now, the paradox with Gary is the idea. Gary spouts anti-natalist philosophy based on a to move away from suffering. And then he has particular minions or followers like derived energy and the sort who use, like Anton, intransitive verbs and intransitive prepositions, which, once again, Anton would sum up to a point of his ambiguity when the intransitive, the lack of signified or opening the signified of an intransitive verb or intransitive prepositions keeps the openness itself that Anton would consider ambiguous. Derived energy will actually move an element such as referencing a being prior to its existence as a signified, because he's using a biological narrative that a lot of us use to speak about a pre-existing thing, right? You know, Gary's irony here, the paradox with Gary, is that he uses the term imposition on something else instead of saying that imposition of a birthed mammal, it would be imposed upon the environment, not that the creation of, and yes, unless using the biological narrative, the imposition is not on the individual itself. The imposition is always something that something is doing to another object or another entity. And he may argue this, but it doesn't seem to change the idea that something imposes itself upon another thing. To say that life, the very definition of what a thing is itself an imposition on the thing. Life imposes life upon itself, right? Parents impose life into a being might be the same as saying the being is alive, right? There is no imposition of life because there's no thing, no life that is separate from the life being described, which would be the recipient of that which is imposed. The paradox with Gary in terms of suffering is that Gary, of his own admission, has not physiologically suffered. He's not physiologically suffered bone breaks, tendon breaks, tears. I don't even know if he's had a cavity. Apparently he's been in fights. He sympathizes with industrial pig farms, mostly as his argument in terms of neuroganglial pain that is attempted to be reduced. He's gotten a lot of fist fights. I believe he's more a sympathizer but not an empathizer with pain. And the sympathy comes from his dad's burns and seeing animals die and considering what must be very painful. But he, without breaking bones or tendons, only imagines carnage in a sympathetic form, but is not an empathetic. Hence, he's not speaking from any basis other than what might be deemed an imagination, an imagining what it would be like, right? And the same thing with derived energy. Derived energy does not suppose that his parents would actually enjoy his absence via suicide. He keeps imagining that they couldn't do that, when in fact, my talking to his parents, they do want him to die. They're just afraid to tell him that. Or some kid in there, but might as well not be. So the irony with Gary is that he's never suffered what it is he is claiming to keep the element of life from. Life having an element of pleasure and an element of suffering. He wants to keep suffering away. He's never experienced it, so he sympathizes from that. Some paradox. Let me lay it out in another video also, I guess.